Hey everybody, Jesse here from Reconnect Rochester and the Rochester Cycling Alliance. Thanks for tuning in for our first ever virtual street film. We want to begin tonight with an acknowledgement of the intense pain that Rochester is experiencing right now in the wake of the news of Daniel Prude's death. Those of us involved in putting this together, our hearts and minds are in this justice movement happening in our streets right now. And we questioned whether it made sense to continue our plan to talk about biking in Rochester. And we concluded it may not seem obvious, but as our panelists will make clear tonight, there is a connection in all this. Equity will be a big topic as the evening progresses, along with what kind of city we want to be for all residents. Tuesday, we witnessed 190 people show up for the ride for Daniel Prude. We know so many of you also understand the interconnectedness of these issues and the desire for cycling to be a uniting force in our community. As Michael Colville Anderson of the Copenhagenized design firm points out, it's not about the bike necessarily. It's about the bicycle's role in our cities and in our lives, how the bike contributes in the grander, more inclusive vision of city development and improvement. And we believe that the bike does have a role in that equity. We hope that you enjoy the film, Why We Cycle. It's really, really well done. In my opinion, it's the best cycling as transportation film out there. I did want to point out one particular weak spot of the film. It kind of gives people the idea that Dutch culture has always been this way and that they've never had the same issues that we struggle with. It does skip how their society used to be, just as car-centric as ours, and it took a big movement in the 1970s to kind of overturn their car-centric culture and to get to where they are today. It took a lot of work, and this documentary skips that history and just focuses on their societal values. So we're going to use that as a springboard tonight to discuss local values and how we can help build a more equitable transportation network in Rochester. So finally, I just wanted to thank our sponsors who made this event possible. The premier sponsor was the Rochester Area Community Foundation. Our gold sponsors were Full Moon Vista and Woman Tours. Our classic sponsors were Our Community Bikes, Bike Zone, and Tom's Pro Bike. And our in-kind sponsor is Editions Printing. So thank you so much, and we can't wait for the discussion that follows. Thanks.
An evening announcer on WXXI Classical 91.5, as well as a bike commuter, someone who bikes in some ways in part due to necessity, but recently I've been appreciating it more and more for all these different reasons that we've been talking about. In fact, today rode the canal to Palmyra and back, which was a bit of an adventure. So I'll ask all our panelists to turn on their videos now. We can greet them for the discussion. And I will just briefly give you an introduction to who we have here to talk with us and answer some questions as we talk about what this movie brings up for us here in Rochester and different aspects of our culture as well. Mitch Gruber is the Chief Strategy Officer at Foodlink and member of the Rochester City Council. He chairs the Parks and Public Works Committee, and he strives to make Rochester a more bikeable and walkable city. Robin Wilt is a Town of Brighton Council member, chair of the Community Services Committee and co-chair of the Financial and Administrative Services Committee, organizing committee and member of Local Progress New York and co-founders of the grassroots group Citizens for East Avenue Bike Lanes. We also have Elizabeth Murphy, who's a member of the City of Rochester's Planning Office and considers it a tremendous privilege and responsibility to work as a planner in her hometown. She credits bike-centric, free-range childhood growing up in the South Wedge with cultivating her independence, curiosity, and lifelong love of cities and the outdoors. She's been a bike commuter in Sacramento, Ithaca, DC, and Somerville, Massachusetts. And Neely Kelly is a climate movement organizer and bikes as transportation advocate. Neely and her family just returned from a year-long sabbatical in Copenhagen, Denmark, and she's committed to taking lessons learned from living in one of the most bike-friendly European capitals to advancing bike-friendly policies and infrastructures in the Rochester area. So welcome to all of our panelists. I'm trying to make it so that I can see everyone here as well as seeing my notes, but I'm going to trust that you're all here. Maybe a quick hello. So each of these questions that we've put together can be answered by anyone, but some may speak to some particularly your interests and focus of your work and how it relates to and what inspired you about the film. We'll also be taking some questions from the audience as part of this discussion. So we're starting with the thing that comes essentially before this movie and all that we've seen, which is that the Netherlands used to be as car dependent and auto-centric as the US after World War II. Culture change happened in large part due to the Stop the Kindermoord child death movement, a group led by concerned mothers after a number of auto deaths. So do you think we can have the will to change without such an overwhelming traumatic impetus?
I could take a first stab at this really huge question.
Sure.
I would hope not. I would hope that it doesn't take tragedy to motivate change. I think maybe sadly, often change does come after tragedy. But I think really what a lot of that is being organizing and building power. And oftentimes tragedy is like a tipping point, a trigger to get people out and organizing and building power and then applying pressure to decision makers to make change. And so I think that's really the key, is how on whatever the issue is in this community discussion tonight, we're talking about bikes and equitable access to our neighborhoods and infrastructure and safety. What's the animating organizing force to get these issues high enough and elevated on a level to raise them in the public conversation and build the power to whether it's to educate decision makers or it's just to motivate decision makers to change decisions and investments to make those improvements.
And that's Robin, you as an advocate who's part of a project working on that bike lane project, what do you feel it takes?
Well, again, I'm hoping that it won't take a catastrophic event or series of events to change the policy in the United States, but we're all familiar with the quote that power concedes nothing without a demand. And to that point, we're seeing a number of grassroots organizations that are stepping up to make those demands of our public elected and appointed officials. I think that how I became familiar with Reconnect Rochester was through my involvement with a grassroots organization called Citizens for East Avenue Bike Lanes. And that really grew organically from the public input Department of Transportation regarding the road diet that was planned for Route 96, also known as East Avenue. And that was from the border of the city of Rochester to where the road intersects 31F. And my house just happens to sit about midpoint in the project. And in that case, a number of grassroots organizations like Rochester Cyclists Association, Color Brighton Green, Rochester People's Climate Coalition, et cetera, came together to see if we could improve the design of the roadway as a multimodal thoroughfare. And as we know, New York State DOT is primarily concerned with automobile throughput, not with overall access to all forms of transportation. And we knew also that the lane configuration on East Avenue was anticipated as a project that would not see another revision for 30 years. So it was really important to try to get the New York State DOT to make this lane configuration as multimodal as possible. They'd already planned to make sidewalks ADA compliant. So we were really focused on connectivity and improving bike access. And ultimately, we didn't get our full-fledged federally compliant 5-foot bike lanes, but through public pressure, we were able to increase the width of the shoulder from 3.5 feet that was anticipated to 4.5 feet, which does make a huge difference in terms of bikeability for the roadway and also perceived safety from the bicyclist perspective. So in addition to organizations like Citizens for East Avenue bike lanes. There are organizations like Families for Safe Streets for All, and our own local version of that, Brighton Safe Streets for All, that are trying to bring about policy and legislative change to end traffic violence, as they term it. And that language in and of itself really changes the perception of traffic crashes, actually calling that thing a thing, naming it as violence as opposed to merely incidents or accidents, just puts it in a different, less acceptable light. And ultimately, I think it is all about that. It's about changing perception. And right now, we view traffic crashes in the current way that our traffic infrastructure is configured as inevitable. And we need to fundamentally reimagine that reality, just like the BLM movement is asking that we reimagine policing. And in the case of BLM, it's taken several very high-profile tragedies to spark what is in essence a continuation of the civil rights movement. But I hope just by evolving the language and more people interacting with our infrastructure as cyclists and pedestrians, that we can change culture and ultimately reimagine that infrastructure for everyone.
And Mitch, perhaps you can add on to that, someone who's sort of seeing change from the inside in a way that Robin has seen it, I think also from the inside of a government, that what does it take even when you're inside to get that will to move things forward?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and for everyone for having me on the panel. And I do want to start by talking about, you know, what culture change really means, because that's what we are talking about. I think that's even specifically, Mona, what your question was about, is in terms of culture change. And sadly, I'm actually not sure that we see that culture change without a crisis. But I guess the more kind of straightforward answer is that I think we could all probably acknowledge that we're in the midst of a crisis as we speak, right? And we're not just in the midst of one crisis. I mean, prior to you know, the outbreak of a pandemic and the outbreak of, as Robin eloquently stated, the kind of continuation of the most critical civil rights battle our nation has seen in many years, we are also dealing with a climate crisis. And I think all of these things collectively, we are in that crisis, and we really don't have a choice anymore. I think one of the major problems is that we can't, and this is not meant to kick the can down the road, but we can't focus on one level of government being able to create this culture change. We need it at the local level, in terms of the city. We need it at all the towns, the county. We need it at the state level. And damn it, we need it at the federal level. And we're really, really far removed from that at this moment in September of 2020. But I think the challenge in front of us is for us to have collective advocacy across the nation with the types of grassroots organizations Robin was mentioning, and having those organizations coalesce so that we can really start to have a culture change in this country related to not just bicycling, but generally related to our climate crisis.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Oh, go ahead.
I think the point that I wanted to make is that Denmark started shifting to a bike culture. So I watched this, we didn't make it to the Netherlands while we were living in Denmark for the year. And so I watched this through that lens of having lived without a car for a year. We had 6 or 8 bikes, I forget, while we were there. But Denmark did shift from a car-centric culture to a bike one in the 70s with the oil crisis. So it doesn't, you know, the crisis doesn't have to be human tragedy. And I think I think we are experiencing a crisis right now, not an oil crisis yet. But with COVID and, you know, the bikes selling out across the country, a global bike shortage, I think that's something to keep in mind, I see it possible without a human tragedy and crisis that the Netherlands saw. And the other thing that I wanted to point out about Rochester is how, and what I noticed in the film too with the Netherlands, is the gorgeous landscape, and how Rochester has some of the most extraordinarily beautiful like scenery that people don't have to enjoy just recreationally. And if I know there are people thinking about this already. I'm not super plugged into how that is, but my hometown is Greenville, South Carolina, and I don't know if anyone is familiar with the revitalization that happened, making it pedestrian and way more bike friendly as a result of really exploiting, for lack of a better word, the natural beauty of the waterfalls and the river downtown to sort of bring people down, you know, to the community, to community events and concerts and things like that, restaurants. So those are just, I think Rochester has more actually than Greenville. Don't tell anyone in Greenville I said that, but I think Rochester really is quite stunning, and that can only add to the pleasure of biking as transportation, not just for recreation.
Hear, hear. Yeah, definitely been experiencing some of that. And even whether it's just leaving work at WXXI with everyone out walking by High Falls, that I almost forget how special it is because I just go past it every day on my way to work. And it's a destination to, yeah, continuing to travel along the canal. So, and we've had some other comments and questions that sort of relate to that notion. I think that's been alluded to, the county and the city and the towns working together. But what are some Rochester or even surrounding towns and county values and goals that would be realized by getting more people on bikes? Specifically, perhaps you can think about the 2034 plan or other plans by towns, what we want to see our city and town be and look like. And I don't know if this is a natural lead-in for Mitch perhaps here, and then we'll kind of, but also for Robin with Brighton.
I know you may think it's a natural lead-in for me when you mention Rochester 2034, but I'm always going to defer to my good friend Elizabeth Murphy, who is one of the architects of that plan. So I'm going to let her talk about it, but I will say that I never leave home without it. It stays with me all the time. It's important for people to, I mean, really, I hope that the time we have together now, one thing that people walk away from is understanding just how powerful Rochester 2034 is and what an opportunity we have to make that the kind of center point of development in this community moving forward. And we do need the suburban towns to follow and join us. This cannot be done just citywide. So Elizabeth, I'll pass it over to you.
Sure. So hopefully a lot of the people participating in this event, or maybe most of you have heard of Rochester 2034, which is the new comprehensive plan that we worked on over the last about 3 years and adopted last fall in November. I should say City Council adopted it officially. And it's a 15-year plan. This is a pretty typical process that communities will go through of looking at what's their long-range vision, what are the guiding principles and values that inform that vision, and then you articulate through exploring a variety of topics your goals and strategies that will help get you towards achieving that vision. And one thing that I do want to say, that I'm not sure if we always make this point, but you know, it's very common for communities to go through a comprehensive planning process. Most communities hire an outside consultant to write a plan for them. And what we really love about this plan is that our planning office, there's 4 of us, and a number of our colleagues in City Hall, we wrote this plan. We did all of the community engagement, which was extensive for us over the course of 2 years, and we wrote every word that's in that plan. So, and we were very intentional about the language that we included there. And biking, walking, you know, better integrating transportation and land use to really emphasize place and people and neighborhoods and values is really central and woven throughout the plan. And for any of you who aren't familiar with it, you can go to the city's website, and if you just type a search for Rochester 2034, that will bring up a link to the plan. And I think I saw someone in the chat was asking about the guidebook Mitch held up, and you can find copies of that on the city's website as well at the plan page. But in our vision and our guiding principles, the kinds of words that you're going to find are words like equitable, beautiful, lively, vibrant, welcoming, accessible, resilient, sustainable, green, people, place. And I think what we just heard from all of the testimony in this film is how those adjectives were carried through so many of the stories of people testifying what having bike culture is just such a fundamental part of everyday life, what that means to them. So I think biking is woven really strongly throughout. There's more than 30 individual strategies in the plan that specifically call out some aspect of how we want to support and further and improve bicycling infrastructure, bicycle networks, bicycle safety, bicycle culture in Rochester. So I would definitely encourage you all to check it out, and then to hold us and our public leaders accountable to be implementing the plan and working with partners like Reconnect or others to move it forward and to help get those things done in the next 15 years. It's a lot of work, and we need to do it together.
Are there others who want to chime in sort of on this planning process and what this means for both the city and the towns in our region?
I would, and I would kind of like to take it back a step because right now the Genesee Regional Transportation Council, which is the metropolitan planning organization for the Finger Lakes region, is holding a series of public input sessions for input on the 2045 long-range transportation plan for the entire 9-county region that includes the city of Rochester and Monroe County. And the first session was held on August 25th, and it's available online. I'll put the website address into the chat. But I believe the next public feedback session for the long-range transportation plan will be this winter. And the Genesee Regional Transportation Council is a really important agency because this is the regional policy board that is responsible for regional transportation policy planning and investment decision making as it pertains to federal funding for the region's surface transportation system. They're responsible for 3 major work products: the long-range transportation plan, Unified Plan Work Program, and the Transportation Improvement Program, or plan, TIP, that we all are familiar with when we're trying to access transportation funding. And the long-range transportation plan is the umbrella that sets the strategic direction for all of our actions and programs with regard to transportation. The other component is the UPWP, is the concept level planning document that's shared with all of the municipalities and member agencies to perform planning studies. And the TIP is the capital improvement funding that actually funds the concept level plans that are implemented. And it's a requirement for the region to create this long-term transportation plan in order to receive federal funding for the region. But that's basically the means by which the 2034 comprehensive plan for the city of Rochester, the 2028 Envision Brighton comprehensive plan, and Brighton's bike walk plan from 2012, those are all examples of UPWP studies that provide insight into the fact that the public is demanding more cycling access. They are demanding more equitable transportation plans, and they're demanding multimodal opportunities and connectivity, not only for recreation, but also for sustainability and lifestyle needs. And I think that preliminarily, we're finding that COVID-19 has also increased the demand for cycling and pedestrian infrastructure, and just those perceptions of public safety matter. And if people perceive a particular segment of bike infrastructure to be unsafe, they'll do what they can to avoid it. So we just need to make sure that as we develop these plans, we're participating in the process.
And Mona, if you don't mind me just hopping on, I see John asked a question about how these plans are implemented, and I just want to say, I mean, there is a moment where the plan has to be where you have to hold elected officials accountable. I mean, there's no other way around it. But I'll tell you that I really think that the planning process is democracy in action. I mean, Elizabeth and the team that she sits on solicited public feedback for the better part of 2 years. More meetings than I think they could count. And in the end, that work ultimately informed the comprehensive plan. It sits there now. And now every single time that City Council gets a piece of legislation, it is our job to make sure that that legislation aligns with the comprehensive plan. It is our job to be able to ask the administration, how does that happen? And I'll tell you firsthand, and I think Elizabeth and anybody who is there from the city on the call would acknowledge this. Since this comp plan was adopted, any single time, I'm the chair of the Parks and Public Works Committee, which means that anything related to road redesign comes through my committee. Anytime we are doing any redesign of the road, it is my duty to ask the administration, what are you doing about bike lanes? Because I have evidence that this is what the people want, right? The evidence is right here. It doesn't take more than that. So I can say, this is what we need, this is what we want, how are we doing it? And of course, each project is gonna bear itself out a little differently based on the realities, but I would point to East Main Street and the fact that we ultimately, you know, after a lot of community advocacy, East Main Street is gonna have separated raised bike lanes as a huge win that was directly informed by the comprehensive planning process. So, you know, John, that's to say that if you feel, or if anyone feels like plans that towns or cities are creating are not being implemented, then it is time to make that very public and noted by people, because that is our job, is to implement those plans.
And thank you for the comments, and also for everyone. The chat is almost flying by so fast that I can't keep track of it, but hopefully I know you can save a file of it. So I hope they will, because people are putting in resources. Thank you, Robin and others, for links, because even sometimes for me, as not as directly tied to this sort of advocacy work, being just someone who's been a little bit connected and loves using our bicycle infrastructure and in fact relies on it, sometimes I don't even know the names of which organizations are doing what things. So I think bringing this together this way is really wonderful. So one of the things that we also wanted to ask about, and this came up briefly, was safety, which is that safety matters, but also perceptions of safety matters. If people perceive a particular segment of bike infrastructure to be unsafe, they'll do what they can to avoid it. And there was a clear consensus in this plan that residents want bike lanes upgraded to protected bike lanes, need for the east-west trail to complement north-south Riverway Trail. So how do we get better bike infrastructure, and also what make other people comfortable, and also then I guess to address people's perceptions of safety? This has sort of already been addressed a little bit, but I wanted to make sure to go with this. And that Robin, I think, has some comments, and also this is something that I think Neely might be able to speak to, because she's been somewhere where more people bike, and might have the idea of how people have felt safe or not in different cultures and situations.
Yeah, I can address that. I think the film talks about the concrete plans of traffic designers and how they're sometimes in conflict with the usage pattern of actual cyclists. And I think one of the barriers that we have to increase biking infrastructure is, and this is often overlooked, is that the guidelines of our jurisdictional transportation departments don't always jive with the general perception of safety. And we need to make sure that they're updated with the latest research for traffic safety and best practices, not just here, but those best practices worldwide. And I mentioned the New York State Department of Transportation and East Avenue bike lanes. New York State Department of Transportation design engineers, they actually scoffed when we presented research from Toronto or the World Health Organization. And what ultimately prevented us from getting true bike lanes on East Avenue were antiquated standards that the New York State DOT was adhering to for the mandatory widths of two-way center turn lanes on thoroughfares with traffic volumes that East Avenue has. And the DOT handbook stipulated that traffic lanes on the thoroughfare could be a minimum of 10 feet in width, but the two-way center turn lane, that had a mandatory minimum width of 11 feet. So ultimately, that's how we didn't end up with full 5 feet bike lanes. And we had requested that the DOT use the roadway as a pilot program, but for liability reasons, they wouldn't deviate from their antiquated standard, even though Monroe County DOT has a 10-foot standard. for the same type of thoroughfare in the town of Brighton, and Pittsburgh leadership requested that they deviate from that standard. So we really do need to make sure that we just don't have arbitrary standards within our departments of transportation. And when you're dealing with a community that has roadways that are controlled by different jurisdictions, it can get really hard. At the 12 corners, we have the intersection of town roads, county roads, and state roads. And sometimes that presents a real barrier when their standards are in conflict with what the community is demanding.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And maybe, oops, nope, I'm not muted, sorry. And maybe Neely, you could also talk about that sense of perception of safety and what we're talking about with. So
I actually wanted to make a point about the, sort of follow up on a little bit on what Robin was saying about how complex the processes are and the decision making and the, and the disconnect between the standards and the, what needs to happen. And the point that I wanted to make, because I'm looking, there've been more than 100 people on this panel. And I saw in an email the Plan 2034, and I was like, oh, I'm going to read that. And then I opened it up and it was 460 pages. And I thought, I'm not reading that in the next 2 hours. And so I think I wanted to just make the point of how critically important it is for people, to understand and to know when the decisions are being made that can improve all this infrastructure, and what they need to do to put pressure on that, to put pressure on those decision makers. Like, I was part of the Citizens for East Ave Bike, and it was incredible. Like, we showed up at town board meeting after town board meeting after, and there were probably more, and I wasn't there, but I know that Reconnect Rochester is really working to sort of develop that outside game, right? Where you really organize and mobilize the public to weigh in without having to read 460. I guess I see a role, and I think Reconnect sees this as well, like being able to synthesize the information and the decision points, and when and where the public can show up. So I just wanted to make that point. Like, if the 100 people, it does not take thousands and thousands of people to sway public officials. Okay, so I had to say that. I come from an organizing background, so I was like, we gotta show up in numbers. And when it comes to health and safety, so throughout Copenhagen, actually most of Denmark, even in the countryside, the bike lanes are separate. And it was such a joy to bike anywhere because I felt 100% safe. And I was kind of anxious about coming back to Rochester, knowing drivers are lazy, they are distracted, and they can be aggressive. And I saw a tremendous amount of bike infrastructure that had changed just in the year, like designated bike lanes, more sharrows. And I know some other infrastructure has happened as well. Helmets were somewhat optional when we lived in Denmark, and they're not anymore. Denmark, I'd say maybe 60% of the people, more people are wearing them in Copenhagen than I saw in that video, for sure. And so I think awareness, we need more people on the road. And I know that when there are a lot of bike classes and courses for interest of bikers, safety is a big thing. And I guess so I don't really say I don't feel like I'm saying anything more insightful. Like, we do need more people out doing it, but we need to create the conditions where they feel safe doing that. And one thing, everyone, attending this may already know this already, but I've been cycling for 25 years. And the concept of the Danish left, and maybe I wasn't paying attention in the video, but it's like, when you need to take a left turn, I would just pull out into traffic and, sort of hope I wouldn't get rear-ended by a car that was looking at their cell phone. And maybe I shouldn't describe it now because it'll get super complicated, but it's like the Danish left. It's like you cross it's too complicated to describe, but it's a safe way. I feel like one of the most dangerous things to do, is when the bike lane is when cars, there's not much room for cyclists and cars, and they go by me, really, can go by me, and I just take up the lane, but not all cyclists are comfortable doing that. So that's uncomfortable. And then taking a left turn, I feel like is really kind of nerve-wracking, but there is a safe way to do it and feel safe. So
Mona, can I just add something real quick? First of all, I do want to make a plug because I don't disagree with what you're saying, Neely, but I also have to push back a little bit. The comprehensive plan is 460 pages. The city also, Elizabeth and her team did an amazing job of making it incredibly digestible. So let's not use the length of it as a thing that prevents us from reading it, because you can go on to the website, as I hope people are doing right now, and play around with it. And you could just go to the part about placemaking. You could just go to the part about multimodal transportation. So one thing that I really don't, and Neely, this is not a criticism of you, one thing I don't like generally, and this is the former academic in me speaking, is that sometimes a lot of people talk about how things collect dust on shelves, but they partially collect dust on shelves because we allow them to collect dust on shelves. So I really encourage people to play with the comprehensive plan, but I'd also say that just from an advocacy perspective here, and I know Jesse really wanted me to talk about this, so I'll just mention it briefly. We have a complete streets policy on the books in the city, and it's a very good complete streets policy, and we abide by it. I can say that matter of factly, we abide by it. But as Jesse knows, just because we abide by it doesn't mean we're creating bike infrastructure that makes people feel safe. We could abide by it to the lowest degree possible, and people will still feel unsafe in parts of the city when they're bicycling because of the way the bike lanes actually interact with traffic. Or we can execute it to its maximum capacity, like on East Main Street. And therein lies the discretion that advocacy will get you so far, but I'll tell you what will get you even farther: voting and electing people that care about these things. So in a city like Rochester, in the suburbs and suburban towns that we have, I can say matter of factly that elected officials are incredibly accessible. Let's start putting people into office who really care about these specific subjects, because it's not that hard for us. This is not New York City or LA. We are, city council members we are part-time elected officials. Any of you can reach me. If you email me tomorrow, I'll write you back. It's that simple. So let's start to get people in office who are going to make sure that we adopt our complete streets policy to its maximum.
I also want to just quickly jump in. I really hear Neely's point, though, that, I can get overwhelmed by looking at Rochester 2034, and I helped to write it. It's a really big document. It's dense. There's a lot covered in there. There's like more than 20 different topics, which each have their own action plans with goals and strategies. And so I think that there's really a role for groups like Reconnect to play. You're helping to organize folks that are interested in multimodal transportation and helping to, we did create tools that we hope help make the plan more digestible and, kind of play aroundable and interactive for people. But Reconnect is also a forum, and maybe, if your folks would find it helpful, maybe we could schedule a special session where we just try to help walk, Reconnect Rochester folks, your members in your base through the plan to find the things that are most interesting or important to you, so that you can use that as an advocacy tool. I think it is also true that the way that we do bike investments in Rochester, a lot of that work is through individual street projects, which means it's a lot of, different individual road segments, and public meetings are on that particular segment of road. And again, that's a place where Reconnect can help to play a role to inform people of when there are opportunities for public meetings. The Department of Environmental Services, which oversees those those projects and public meeting schedules, they have a pretty regular announcement that goes out, and I'm fairly certain that someone from Reconnect is on that list to be notified of when there are meetings. And that's something, that's another tool that can help to provide people information about when to come out. And I would encourage you guys, all of you, to come out, because or to get involved in your neighborhood association, or to get involved in other groups that aren't just, a bike group. Because it'll be interesting to you to hear. There are a lot of people that come out to public meetings that we hear from who don't necessarily want bike lanes, who are really concerned about looting on-street parking, or are just really concerned and passionate about parking in general. And I think it would be great to get more dialogue between all of those people because, politicians and decision makers, they're hearing, from different sides. And if we can get more people interacting and kind of trying to have that conversation come together and hear one another's sides to reconcile, I think that might help to further our community conversation as well.
I think these are some wonderful points, and there's so much going by in the chat. In fact, even getting back to the Danish left, someone brought up the Mount Hope Ford Street Bridge and the green box there. So, but perhaps we can also just know to Google later the Danish left so we can walk ourselves through it. Just from a personal point of view, again, with this experience riding more recreationally and further away, I sometimes worry that I want bikes and I need bike lanes, but is it as many people, but then I see all the comments here, but even just being on the canal or Lehigh Trail and seeing people who are not on the long haul ride that I am, but using this infrastructure, or being in the city and being on El Camino, or just there's so many people that this does apply to in different ways. And that is actually one of the last planned questions we had, which I think is a really important one to get to, which is that many Americans think of cycling only in terms of recreation as a hobby. But Rochester has many residents who bike not because they want to, but because it's their only means of getting around. Of necessity, cyclists can be invisible to many eyes, even especially avoiding major thoroughfares, and may not self-identify as cyclists and aren't involved in this bike advocacy or on cycling mailing lists. How can we make sure that our infrastructure is meeting their needs?
I love that question, and I talk about this all the time with people. So I'm just going to reference my next door neighbor. I live on King Street. I live in off of West Main Street in a fairly low income part of the city of Rochester, and my next door neighbor, a very good friend of mine, 61-year-old African American male, no car, no license, no insurance. This man is the greatest bike rider I have ever seen. It doesn't matter. Nothing will stop him from getting where he's got to go. We have both had to get to the same place. I've offered him a ride. He didn't want to be beholden to my car, and he figures out how to get there quicker than me. And none of the bicycling infrastructure matters to him because he's just a monster on the bike. And I think that's an incredible thing about my neighbor, but it's also an incredible challenge for the bicycling community, because as I've challenged to the people in Reconnect over and over again, if you can't figure out how to get my neighbor Rodney as someone who's helping to advocate, then you're missing the swath of the population who is ultimately, they are the people we're talking about who are transit riders, not hobby riders. But Rodney doesn't really care about advocacy because he's already able to get from point A to point B, right? Even if the infrastructure make it easier or safer, it's not stopping him because he's been doing it for probably 40 years without thinking about it. So I think that is the challenge. I don't have an answer. I don't think any of us have an answer, because if we did, we'd figure it out. We'd have it figured out by now. But it is the challenge, and I'm telling you right now that, and I've told it to everyone on Reconnect, who I've talked to before, and probably many people in the chat, if we don't figure out how to make bicycling and active transportation, the advocacy groups, a wider cross-section of this community, we will never make it a successful issue. We have to show that it has a wide cross-section of people who care about it for health, for safety, for climate change, for economic development, for so many different things. And we've seen the studies, but now it's time to go mobilize people. And you got to mobilize Rodney. I'll tell you that much right now.
Do any of our other panelists want to speak to that question? It's also just interesting to me as a necessity rider to see a lot of the people in the movie talking about, even though it's kind of a necessity or a convenience thing, that it still brings them joy, that in some ways there's not always as much separation, I think, as of the joy, the role that being happy, comfortable, clearing your mind, all these things can also play in these things, into this experience. Whatever gets you out there is one thing, but what you experience while you're there might be something else.
I'll jump in quickly. I think the question is, it's fundamentally important. For me, you know, I work in the city's planning office, so my job is to be thinking citywide. And I mean, really, if we want to think about improving bike culture in our city, we have to go beyond that too, because we know that, you know, nearly 40% of city residents who work are commuting outside of the city to get to their jobs. So we need to make it safe and accessible to get to those jobs as well, and other trips, you know, services and grocery stores and healthcare and all those kinds of things. So we definitely need a regional approach. But in terms of where I sit, I think about bike infrastructure in terms of a network, and really looking at that network and looking at a range of different indicators also related to equity, to safety, to risk, to access around healthcare, social services, employment, school, parks. And how do we look at where we have existing infrastructure and try to fill in the gaps in our network, and target and prioritize places that we know through data collection over time and evaluation have a traffic safety risk or a traffic safety disparity. So I think stepping out of my own realm and trying to look at a broader picture around the city is one way and lens to explore equity and where and how to build out an infrastructure network that goes that. I think, you know, infrastructure is only one part of what we need to get to better bike culture. It's certainly not the only thing. But for advocates, I would say the same thing. What can you know, everyone on this event do to step out of our own, you know, where do we ride our bikes, or where do we go from day to day, and try to think broader in terms of a citywide or a countywide, some sort of regional wide level, to think about what the gaps might be and put yourself in someone else's shoes.
And since we're coming pretty close on time, I want to make sure that Robin and Neely also get to talk to this, or anyone also just adds a sort of last big thoughts. My brain is going 100 different directions with all of this, but that's a great thing about this, that I think it's this, even as we're coming to the end of this panel, this is a beginning of a lot of things.
Absolutely. And I will say that just meeting people where they are, and I think we have a lot of these public input sessions, but people don't know how to connect with them, or at what point in the process it's important to connect with them. I think working with multi-jurisdictional departments of transportation has taught me that, you know, generally the public input window is fairly small. It's fairly limited, and trying to connect like a Rodney or Robbie, or Mitch's neighbor, with that public input period is going to be really challenging. And so I think that we need to develop and we need to be committed to getting input from constituents, not just through those public input periods, but also just throughout the process. And it's really hard because we do have our plans, and we're beholden to the plans. Brighton developed a bike walk plan in 2012, and even though it's getting long in the tooth, and we've developed trail systems and connection systems since that, you know, we were determined to not have it be that plan that sat on a shelf. And so we've made it available to the public so that they can continue to offer feedback. And so just making sure that once we develop the plans, they're not static, and that there are many more opportunities for public feedback. And so a lot of what was in our 2012 bike walk plan is also in our 2028 Envision Brighton plan, which paid particular attention to equity, sustainability, and accessibility for all. And so I think just making sure that these plans don't remain static, and making sure that the public, we're continually seeking that input is so important.
And some of that I think is interesting to me is that these things develop, and I already bike a lot, but I don't always find out about them. I just had someone take me on Warrington instead of just going down Monroe, and I was like, oh, or going down Elmwood, or to realize I could take Highland Crossing or the Brickyard over to Westfall, that even though it's a busy road, it's a lot. I just one day went back to my old habit of riding on Elmwood, and I thought, nope, 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 nope. You know, just said there's so good options. And sometimes for me, it's just a friend takes me biking that way. And that's how I found out that there's a safer, better way to do something. So I appreciate things like the Women's Bike Festival or our networks where we can perhaps spread, you know, and perhaps everyone figures these things out themselves as well. But I wanted to make sure, also I love Marty Knott in the comments said part of the challenge is to expand to not have this be just these two groups, but it's necessity and to utility, where bicycling is a choice, not just the necessity. So that's, I think, what we saw a lot of in the movie, where I could drive, but it's also kind of nicer to bike, or it's easier, or there's a reason, and the infrastructure sometimes defines that. I don't know if we have as many places as they do where it's actually faster to bike. So. And I wanted, again, because I know I'm supposed to wrap up my part at 8:25 and our discussion. And again, there's a million things about training for kids in bicycling, about more inclusive for different abilities, lots of other things to continue to discuss. So hooray for the chat and making sure we keep up with all of this and save these notes for future discussions. But since I haven't had Neely in a while, I wanted to make sure that you got another comment in before we wrapped up and went back to this.
Thanks so much, Mona. So I think to Mitch's point about outreach in these neighborhoods, it is an enormous problem because it takes so much time, effort, and energy to do that outreach. And I don't have the answers, but I think Robin, you know, saying we need a plan to engage those folks. And I'm pretty sure Reconnect has been working on this and has done a tremendous amount of outreach and really centered the more low-income neighborhoods as well. But it is a challenge, and I think Mitch is exactly right. Like, it's something that a lot of white-led groups are wrestling with in a very real way, and there's a lot of hand-wringing. And so, yeah, I don't really have anything else to say about that. But the one thing that did occur to me, and I think I saw it in the chat somewhere, but the integration with the public transportation system. And I know RTS is undergoing this, like, reimagine RTS or whatnot. And Robin, I think you said it in the chat when we were watching the film about, oh my God, the grooves and the stairs, like, that's just mind blowing. And I'm like, oh yeah, that was totally normal. That's everywhere, like every stair you go to, like in Denmark, and there aren't that many hills, but there can be some stairs. Anyway, but at the train station, bikes weren't allowed on buses in Denmark. They were only allowed on like the regional and the local trains, and they made it super easy to get, you know, anywhere from 50 to 80 bikes on a train. And I know RTS, you can put 2 bikes on the front of the train, but I've been thinking even before we moved to Denmark, like, you really need to have a bigger capacity for bikes on these buses. Like, that would make so much more of this area so much more accessible to so many people. Like, I can't tell you how far I went, like the miles I was able to go in Denmark. I mean, the headwinds there are intense, like 15 to 20 mile an hour daily, every day. And if I wanted to go out for a 40-mile bike ride, I didn't want to do that in 25-mile-an-hour headwinds. So I'd plan my bike route to just have a tailwind the whole way. I'd take the bus, or I'd take the train out and I'd bike in, or I'd bike out and I'd take the train in. But I just wanted to make the point, and I don't know if this is happening, and I realize we're about out of time, but if there's some way to increase capacity for integrating the public transportation, specifically the bus system in the Rochester area, I think that would make it so much easier for so many people out in the suburbs and in the city. And that's all I'll say. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for all these ideas. And actually, yeah, I'm really glad that the Women's Bike Festival has an opportunity to train on the front of the bus thing, because I think the first time I did it was in the movie about biking in the winter. And I was certain that I had stopped all traffic in Rochester and everyone was staring at me and it was the end of the world. And I was, you know, but it's such a simple thing. Yeah. Or when I've been rained on when I've been biking, to catch the bus and be able to ride at home. That integration is great. So, also, people have brought up, I think, just seeing many things coming through. Thank you so much to all the panelists. People have mentioned the Unity rides and Black Girls Do Bike, important groups, and especially great rides that I've got to remember to take off from work the same day as one of those rides, so that, because they always overlap when I'm still on the radio playing music. But I want to thank so much Robin Wilt, Mitch Gruber, Neely Kelly, and Elizabeth Murphy for sharing their perspectives, and to all the questions. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to everything, but again, I'm thinking hopefully we'll export the chat, and that is the beginning of more of the work, and there are links to the various plans and organizations, and I will turn things over, I think, to Susan Levine next. And again, thank you all very much, and look forward to seeing you out on the roads and the trails and everywhere else.
Hi, thanks, Mona. Hi, I'm Susan Levine. I'm a board member at Reconnect Rochester and the chair of the RCA Reconnect Cycling Work Group. And I want to really express again our great, huge thanks to our sponsors, especially Rochester Area Community Foundation, Full Moon Vista, and Women Tours. Thanks again to our panelists and moderator, Mitch, Robin, Elizabeth, Neely, and Mona, for your knowledge and perspectives and work to really promote a more safe, convenient, and equitable biking community. Elizabeth, I think we would like to take you up on your offer to follow the conversation. So keep posted. We'll let people know what's going on our newsletter. Few quick notes. The film is available on Vimeo to watch again or to share. Please join us for Bike Week coming up September 18th through the 27th this month. There is a full list of events going to be on the City of Rochester's website. You can search for Bike Week 2020. Also, please complete the survey. There should be a link in the chat and also posted on the screen. And one last thank you really to our audience and our supporters. We're absolutely grateful for your interest and support. We hope tonight's conversation will inspire you to get involved with the RCA and join our efforts, and pedal on.